Donald Trump receives a veteran's desperate letter. His response shocks the nation. Late at night, the wind howled through the deserted streets. The red glow of police lights flickered faintly, blending with the distant wail of sirens. A shadow darted through a narrow alley. Breath ragged, heart pounding, a young man, his eyes wide with terror, was being hunted. "Stop right there," a deep voice echoed through the night. A single gunshot shattered the eerie silence. Miles away, in a small, dimly lit house, an old man with silver-streaked hair sat at a worn wooden table. His rough, calloused hands trembled as he pressed his pen to paper. "Mr. President, I write this letter as my final plea. They have taken my son. Please help us before it's too late." A single letter. If it reached the White House, it could change the fate of an entire town. But would it ever be read? And more importantly, what would the president do once he knew the truth? A brutal war between justice and crime was about to unfold. But the real enemy wasn't just across the border, it was much closer than anyone had imagined. The forgotten border town. The desert wind howled, sweeping clouds of red dust over the cracked roads of a forgotten border town near Mexico. Wooden houses, old and weathered, stood huddled together, their peeling paint whispering tales of better days. Streetlights flickered dimly, casting long, broken shadows over the pavement, deep fractures splitting the once smooth roads. In the distance, the rumbling of trucks echoed across the barren landscape, their heavy wheels carving paths through the silence. Every so often, another sound cut through the night, something darker, something more sinister. John Carter stood by the window, gripping the edge of a tattered curtain. His face, lined with years of hardship, bore the quiet agony of a man who had seen too much. His hands, once steady, once unshakable, felt cold. He had been a Marine once, a warrior, a protector, a man who had fought on distant battlefields, standing for something greater than himself. He had worn the uniform with pride, believing he was protecting his country. But now, standing in his own home, he felt powerless, because the war hadn't ended. It had simply followed him home. A war on American soil. John wasn't the only one suffering. Families of veterans, men who had once given their youth, their strength, and their very lives to defend this nation, now found themselves trapped in lawlessness and despair. They had survived distant wars and foreign deserts only to return home and face an enemy far more insidious. Because the real threat wasn't on some battlefield overseas, it was here. Inside their own borders. This town had once been peaceful. But in the past 5 years, everything had changed. Drugs, illegal weapons, human trafficking, mysterious deaths. Crime had slithered into every corner, the streets, the bars, even the local police station. Those who resisted disappeared. Those who dared to stand up were forced to bow down. And then the nightmare reached John's doorstep. Liam Carter, his only son, had once been a boy with bright eyes and even brighter dreams. But in a single year, that light had been extinguished. His spirit had withered. His body, once full of youthful energy, had become frail, haunted by a fear too great for words. One night, he stumbled home, his face bruised, his clothes reeking of alcohol and smoke. His hands trembled as he grabbed his father by the arm, his voice a choked whisper of terror. "They'll kill me if I don't do what they say." John felt something inside him shatter. He didn't need to ask what had happened, he already knew. His son had been trapped, and there was no way out. The man who had once stormed enemy lines without flinching now stood powerless before the fear in his son's eyes. But he refused to accept defeat. He reached for the only weapon he had left, a pen. And with it, he wrote a letter, a desperate plea for help, addressed to the one man he believed could change everything, the President of the United States. A letter reaches the White House. In the vast office of the White House, a man with unmistakable golden hair sat behind a polished oak desk. Deep in thought, Donald Trump had returned to the Oval Office after a hard-fought election. Fully aware of the battles that lay ahead, he had been briefed on the worsening crisis at the southern border. He had seen the reports, rising crime, trafficking, the slow decay of law and order. But what he didn't know yet, what no report could prepare him for, was that a single letter, written by a desperate father, was about to change everything. Stacks of border security reports lay neatly arranged before him. Since his re-election, President Trump had ordered stricter control over the region, deploying additional forces and implementing aggressive measures to combat cartel influence. He had seen the numbers, read the statistics, approved countless security initiatives, but what he hadn't expected, what no report could truly capture, was the human cost. John Carter's letter sat at the top of the pile. Trump picked it up. He read it, and as he did, his expression changed. His grip tightened. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just another policy issue. This was personal. He pressed a button on his desk. Within seconds, his top security advisor entered the room. "I want to meet him," Trump said, his voice firm. "Set it up." The advisor hesitated. "Sir, the situation in that town." I said set it up. The room fell silent. The President of the United States had made his decision. And soon, the entire nation would be watching. The fight for justice begins. John Carter never expected his letter to be read. He never expected a response. And he certainly never expected Donald Trump himself to come. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Because when Trump arrived in that town, he wasn't just there to listen, he was there to fight. And what he uncovered would shake the nation to its core. To be continued, Donald Trump receives a veteran's desperate letter. His response shocks the nation. The wind howled through the darkened streets. Police lights flickered in the distance. Sirens wailing as a shadow darted through a narrow alley. A young man, breath ragged, heart pounding, hunted like an animal. "Stop right there," a deep voice echoed through the night. A single gunshot shattered the eerie silence. Miles away, in a small, dimly lit house, an old man with silver-streaked hair sat at a worn wooden table. His rough, calloused hands trembled as he pressed his pen to paper. "Mr. President, I write this letter as my final plea. They have taken my son. Please, help us before it's too late." A single letter. If it reached the White House, it could change the fate of an entire town. But would it ever be read? And more importantly, what would the president do once he knew the truth? The letter that reached the president. The door to the Oval Office opened briskly. Linda Peterson, a senior White House staffer, walked in with purpose, clutching an aged envelope in her hands. She wasn't just another government official. Linda had once been a soldier, a member of the Special Forces. She had seen war. She had seen the worst of humanity. And now, she was holding a letter that could change everything. "Mr. President," she said, her voice low but urgent, "you need to read this." Donald Trump arched an eyebrow, taking the letter from her hands. He unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the words that carried the weight of a father's despair. "Mr. President, I write this letter as my final hope. They have taken my son. We are living in fear, and no one dares to speak out. You are our only chance. If this letter reaches you, please save my son. Save the families trapped here." A heavy silence filled the room. Trump slowly placed the letter on his desk, his expression turning cold, calculating. He had received countless reports about the border crisis, but none had struck him like this. This wasn't just about policy. This was about people. Taking a deep breath, he met Linda's gaze. "Get the Security Council in here. Now." Because this letter wasn't just a cry for help, it was the first shot in a war no one had seen coming. A town under siege. John Carter had sent many letters before. Letters to the town's police department, met with hesitant, downcast eyes. Letters to veteran organizations, met with sympathy but no real action. Letters to journalists, but no one dared to print a word. Every plea, every desperate attempt for help was either ignored or buried beneath an endless mountain of bureaucratic red tape. But this time, John refused to accept silence. He knew that if he didn't act now, his son might never return. And if the government failed to step in, his town would remain under cartel rule forever. So he wrote one more letter. This time, he poured everything into it, his desperation, his final shred of hope, his plea for salvation. But he didn't trust the postal service. If he sent it through the usual channels, it would never reach the president's desk. Instead, he turned to the only person he knew he could trust, Sam Rodriguez, an old war buddy from Afghanistan, now working as a security guard at a government building in Texas. When Sam saw John again after all these years, he barely recognized him. His once strong, fearless friend looked thinner, wearier, as if the weight of the world had pressed down on his shoulders. Are you sure about this, John? Sam asked. Getting a letter straight into the White House, that's not exactly easy. John's voice was hoarse, raw with emotion. I have no choice. If this letter doesn't reach the president, I lose my son. Sam clenched the envelope tightly in his fist. He didn't need to hear another word. I'll find a way. 3 days later, the letter had traveled hundreds of miles, passed from hand to hand until it landed on the desk of a federal employee. Fate had brought it this far, and fate would now place it into the hands of Linda Peterson. The moment of truth. Linda opened the envelope, her sharp eyes scanning the uneven strokes of a desperate father's handwriting. Every word carried agony, fear, and a final plea for salvation. She took a deep breath. This was not just a letter. This was a cry for help. She glanced at the clock. It was late, well past normal working hours. But there was no time to wait. Clutching the letter, Linda strode swiftly down the long hallways of the White House. Outside the president's office, 2 security personnel cast her questioning glances but did not stop her. They knew her. She had worked directly with President Trump during his previous term. And if she was here at this hour, it meant something important had landed on his desk. She knocked. Inside, Donald Trump sat alone, the glow of a desk lamp casting deep shadows across his face. It had been a long day, back-to-back meetings on foreign policy, national security. But when he saw the look on Linda's face, he knew, this was different. Mr. President, she said, her voice steady but urgent. You need to see this. She placed the envelope on the desk. Trump picked it up, unfolded the letter, and began to read. Silence. The steady ticking of the clock was the only sound in the room. Linda watched as his fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the paper. Melania had once told her that there were very few things in this world that could truly unsettle Donald Trump. This letter was one of them. Finally, he looked up, his jaw clenched. His voice was firm. Get my team in here. Right now. Because in that moment, one thing was certain, John Carter's letter had just changed everything. The fight for justice begins. John Carter never expected his letter to be read. He never expected a response. And he certainly never expected Donald Trump himself to come. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Because when Trump arrived in that town, he wasn't just there to listen, he was there to fight. And what he uncovered would shake the nation to its core. To be continued? The president's order. The air inside the White House Situation Room was thick with tension. The walls were lined with massive screens displaying live feeds from the southern border, convoys of trucks moving contraband, groups of migrants trekking across the desert, towns held hostage by cartel rule. Seated around the conference table were the country's top security officials, military generals, intelligence officers, the FBI director, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Linda Peterson stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression as steely as the man at the head of the table. Before President Trump lay a freshly printed report detailing the crisis in the small border town where John Carter lived. He flipped through the pages methodically. Photographs of children forced into cartel drug operations. Veterans abandoned to fear and poverty. Unexplained deaths that told a darker story than official records would admit. His gaze hardened. Then, without looking up, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. How long? FBI Director Mark Reynolds hesitated slightly. Mr. President, that town has been under cartel control for at least 3 years. We've run several operations, but we haven't been able to take out the network at its core. Trump set the file down, leaned back in his chair, and clasped his hands together. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was sharp as a blade. These people aren't just criminals. They're enemies within our own country. Brigadier General Mike Carter, head of Border Patrol, leaned forward. Mr. President, if we're going to act, we need a comprehensive strategy. These cartels aren't just street thugs. They have structure. They have money. And worst of all, they have people protecting them from the inside. Trump remained silent for a moment, considering. Then his decision came, swift and final. I don't care how powerful they think they are. We have the military. We have the FBI. We have special forces. I want that town cleaned up within a month. And I want to know who's pulling the strings. The Secretary of Homeland Security, James Callahan, cleared his throat. Mr. President, This isn't just a crime issue. This is a matter of national security. We have evidence that members of the local government have been taking bribes from the cartels. If we're going to dismantle this operation, we need to start by taking out the corruption first." Trump nodded. "Then we do both. First, we take down the cartel. Second, we root out every single corrupt official helping them. I want a full list within 48 hours. If they're complicit, if they're standing in the way of justice, I want them gone." A heavy silence filled the room. No one dared to challenge the order. Then Linda stepped forward. "Mr. President, I want in on this operation." Trump's cold gaze met hers. "You left the military a long time ago." "Linda, why now?" She clenched her fists. Her voice was steady. "I was out there, sir. I saw soldiers fight and come home to nothing. I saw them abandoned. If no one stands up to protect them, then what the hell did we fight for?" A brief silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Trump nodded. "Fine, you'll work with the FBI. I want daily reports." FBI Director Reynolds furrowed his brow slightly. "Mr. President, if we hit them too hard, they might retaliate against civilians." Trump slammed his hand down on the table. "Then don't give them the chance. I want special forces embedded in that town. I want these people taken down. No gray areas, no negotiations. This is the United States of America, and we do not let criminals run this country." No one argued, no one hesitated. Within hours, the operation was in motion. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation into corrupt officials aiding the cartel. Border Patrol's Special Task Force was mobilized, increasing security sweeps along the southern line. A covert DIA strike team was deployed into the town, posing as civilians, gathering intelligence from within the enemy's ranks. And as the night stretched over the horizon, the heavy roar of military helicopters echoed from a distant base. The mission had begun. The town under siege. The town lay shrouded in darkness. Thick and suffocating, an unsettling silence loomed over the streets, as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting. Because something was coming. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. Liam Carter, a son in chains. Liam Carter sat curled up in the corner of a rundown warehouse. His wrists were bound tightly with plastic zip ties. He had lost track of time. He didn't know how long he had been locked away, nor what fate awaited him. All he knew was this: if no miracle happened soon, he would never make it out alive. The door suddenly swung open, flooding the dark space with blinding light. A man stepped inside. Carlos Mendez, the ruthless cartel boss who ruled over this town with an iron grip. Dressed in a black silk shirt, a gold watch beaming on his wrist, he moved like a king in his empire of terror. Liam's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was coming. But what neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, the full force of the United States was closing in. And Donald Trump was leading the charge. The fight for justice begins. John Carter never expected his letter to be read. He never expected a response. And he certainly never expected Donald Trump himself to come. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Because when Trump arrived in that town, he wasn't just there to listen. He was there to fight. And what he uncovered would shake the nation to its core. To be continued? A deadly standoff. Carlos Mendez sneered, his grip tightening around Liam's collar. The barrel of his gun pressed against the young man's temple. "You're not going anywhere." Liam's heart pounded, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He knew what happened to people who crossed the cartel. His father had warned him. He had seen it in the eyes of others, those who had disappeared. Outside, the strike team was moving. John Carter, standing in the shadows, could barely contain his fury. His fingers twitched against the trigger of his rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to act. But one wrong move could cost him his son's life. Through his earpiece, Linda Peterson's voice was clear and firm. "We go now." A thunderous burst of gunfire shattered the night. The strike team stormed in. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as cartel enforcers fell where they stood. Bullets ripped through the air, cutting down those who tried to flee. Explosions erupted in the distance, shaking the warehouse walls. Carlos Mendez tightened his grip on Liam, dragging him back as he scanned for an escape. His men were being slaughtered. The cartel was losing. His only leverage now was the boy. "Drop your guns," Carlos screamed, his voice raw with rage, "or I put a bullet in his head." John Carter stepped forward. "Liam," he called, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Liam locked eyes with his father. And in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. A single breath. A single chance. Liam drove his elbow into Carlos's ribs. The cartel boss staggered, just enough. John didn't hesitate. The gunshot rang out. Carlos Mendez collapsed. His weapon clattered to the floor. Liam staggered backward, gasping, his body shaking. Then, in the next second, he was in his father's arms. "I got you, son," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now." Outside, the battle was over. The cartel had fallen. Some were captured. Others lay motionless on the ground. The town, once suffocated by fear, was finally free. The call that ended it. Linda Peterson stepped outside the warehouse, surveying the aftermath. Her grip tightened around her phone. She dialed a secure number. A moment later, the president answered. "Mr. President," she reported, "target neutralized. The town is secure." On the other end, Donald Trump's voice was steady and resolute. "Good. Make sure no one dares let this happen again." Linda nodded. "Yes, sir." The battle had ended, but its echoes remained. Somewhere, in some dark corner of the world, someone was watching. The morning after, as dawn stretched across the sky, the scars of the night before were still visible. Police vehicles remained scattered across the streets. Crime scene tape sectioned off areas of destruction. Residents gathered in small clusters, whispering about the brutal war that had unfolded in their backyard. The cartel was either dead or in chains. But no one truly believed it was over. John Carter sat on the front steps of his home, his fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee. His body still tense. His mind replayed every moment of the past 24 hours. Beside him, Liam sat quietly, his hands trembling slightly. The fear hadn't fully left him. It would take time, but at least, they were together. Linda Peterson approached, handing John a second cup of coffee. "You did good, John." He took a slow sip, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "This isn't over," he murmured. "I can feel it." Linda didn't respond, because she felt it too. Everything had happened too fast. Too easily. A cartel this powerful didn't crumble overnight. Not without reason. Inside the White House, inside the Oval Office, Donald Trump sat at his desk, flipping through stacks of intelligence reports. From the FBI. From the DEA. From the Department of Homeland Security. On paper, everything looked clean. But Trump wasn't fooled. He had seen it before. The real enemy never dies in a single night. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Then he picked up the phone. "Call the Director of National Intelligence," he ordered. "We're not done yet. The fight never ends." John Carter had never expected his letter to be read. He never expected a response. And he certainly never expected Donald Trump himself to step in. But now he understood. This war wasn't just about his son. It was about every town, every family, every soldier who had ever fought for this country. Because if corruption still thrived in the shadows, then the battle was far from over. And John Carter? He was ready to fight. The missing piece. The mission was a success. The cartel leaders were taken down. The town, once a breeding ground for fear and crime, was now under government protection. But something wasn't right. Sitting in the Oval Office, Trump flipped through the intelligence report detailing the operation. The facts were clear, too clear. His instincts screamed at him. They had been set up. Trump set the report down, his sharp gaze locking onto FBI Director Mark Reynolds. "Something doesn't add up." Reynolds hesitated. "Sir?" Trump leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, colder. "This cartel ran that town for years. We spent months gathering intelligence just to get a foothold." He tapped a finger against the folder. "And yet, they exposed their entire operation far too easily." "Why?" Reynolds stiffened, his mind racing through the implications. Before he could respond, the door swung open. Linda Peterson strode in. She carried a thick file, and the look on her face told Trump she already knew the answer. She placed the folder on the desk, flipping to a marked section. "Mr. President, I think you're right," she said. She pointed to a set of financial records. One of the bank accounts linked to the cartel had received large wire transfers from a shell company based in Washington, D.C. Reynolds stepped forward, his eyes scanning the document. His face paled. No, that's not possible. Trump narrowed his eyes. Who owns the company? Linda took a slow, steady breath. She flipped to the next page. James Callahan, Secretary of Homeland Security. A betrayal from within. Silence. Thick, heavy, unforgiving. Reynolds shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. Callahan has been in government for over 20 years. He's led some of our most aggressive campaigns against organized crime. This has to be a mistake. Trump's expression didn't change. He had seen too much betrayal in his career to be surprised anymore. If this is true, Trump said slowly, then that town isn't the only one in danger. This is a national conspiracy. Linda nodded grimly. Callahan has been feeding intelligence to the cartel, helping them stay one step ahead of us. But once he realized we were closing in, she exhaled sharply. He sacrificed them, handed them to us on a silver platter. He needed us to wipe them out before we got too close to him. Trump tapped a finger against the desk. They were just the tip of the iceberg. Then, without another word, he stood. His eyes burned with quiet determination. Get the Attorney General on the phone. He turned to Reynolds, his voice cold as steel. I want Callahan investigated immediately. And if these allegations hold up. He locked eyes with the FBI director. I want him to pay. Linda clenched her fists. She had spent years fighting in the shadows, taking down enemies in foreign lands. But this war was different. This time, the enemy wasn't on the streets. It was inside the government itself. A town rebuilds. A week after the battle at the border town, life slowly began to settle. The streets, once ruled by fear and cartel control, were now patrolled by police and federal agents. For the first time in years, people felt safe walking outside at night. The stores that once locked their doors early, wary of violence, were opening again. But while the criminals were gone, their scars remained. Families mourned the loved ones they had lost. Children who had been pulled into the darkness struggled to find their way back. And the veterans, the forgotten warriors, were still trying to figure out where they belonged. John Carter sat on his front porch, watching Liam water the small garden in their yard. He was no longer the terrified, broken boy who had stumbled home in the dead of night. His wounds, both inside and out, would take time to heal. But at least now, he had the chance to start over. John took a sip of his coffee. Beside him, Linda Peterson handed him a second cup. Thank you, he said quietly. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened. Linda smiled, but her eyes were thoughtful. I just did what had to be done, she said. Then, after a pause, she looked at him. John, I think you need to do more. John frowned. What do you mean? She gazed out over the town. The place where men like John had fought one battle, only to come home and face another. Where kids like Liam could so easily be lost, if no one showed them another path. This town needs someone like you, she said. Someone who understands what veterans go through. Someone who can stand up, protect them, and guide them towards something better. She turned back to him. You wrote that letter. You fought for your son. But why stop there? John exhaled slowly, staring into the distance. For the first time, he realized, maybe his fight wasn't over yet. Inside the White House, Washington, D.C., President Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office, staring out through the large window. The mission at the border town was officially over. James Callahan, the Secretary of Homeland Security, had been arrested. And now, he faced the full weight of the law. But Trump knew this wasn't the end. Corruption didn't die overnight. Evil didn't disappear with a single arrest. The cartel was just one piece of the puzzle. The real war, the one against those who betrayed their own country, was just beginning. He turned to his chief of staff. Call the director of national intelligence. His voice was steady, unyielding. We're not done yet. A war that never ends. John Carter never expected his letter to be read. He never expected a response. And he certainly never expected Donald Trump himself to step in. But now he understood. This war wasn't just about his son. It was about every town, every family, every soldier who had ever fought for this country. Because if corruption still thrived in the shadows, then the battle was far from over. And John Carter? He was ready to fight. Justice delivered. James Callahan, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, had been arrested on charges of treason. A full-scale investigation had been launched. aiming to uncover every official tied to the network of corruption that had nearly destroyed a small border town. Trump exhaled deeply, setting the final report down on his desk. He had fought many battles, in business, in politics, and against the deep corruption embedded in Washington. But this was one of the most important fights of his career. Because this wasn't just about policy. It was about the people. It was about families like John Carter's. The door to the Oval Office swung open. Linda Peterson entered, holding an envelope in her hands. "Mr. President," she said, "would you like to read this?" Trump took the envelope, carefully unfolding the letter. His sharp eyes scanned the words, taking in every single one. A veteran's promise. "Mr. President, I don't even know where to begin to thank you. Because of you, my son is safe. Because of you, my town has hope again. But I've realized something important. We can't rely solely on the government to change everything. Those of us who once carried a rifle to protect this country must now stand up and protect our own communities. That's why I, along with other veterans, I'm starting an organization to help soldiers like us find their way back. We will train them, give them purpose, and, most importantly, show them that they are not alone. I write this letter to thank you but also to make a promise. We will never let this place fall into darkness again. God bless America. John Carter." Trump finished reading. A rare smile flickered at the corner of his lips. He carefully folded the letter, setting it down on his desk before looking up at Linda. "This," he said firmly, "is why we do what we do. For people like them." Linda nodded. "Yes, Mr. President. A new beginning." 3 months later, the small border town that had once been consumed by fear now stood reborn. In the heart of the community, a brand new center stood tall, a beacon of hope for veterans, at-risk youth, and families looking for a second chance. A large sign above the entrance read, "John Carter Veteran Support Center." The crowd had gathered for its grand opening. Liam Carter stood among them, his eyes locked on the stage, where his father now stood. John gripped the microphone, his voice strong and steady as he looked out at the faces before him. A veteran's speech. "We have seen dark days. We have felt hopeless. We have feared that there was no way forward." He paused, looking out at the families, the veterans, the young men and women searching for guidance. "But today, we stand here, stronger than ever." A wave of applause erupted through the crowd. Linda stood off to the side, watching the moment unfold. A quiet pride burned in her chest. Because this wasn't just a victory. This was a new beginning. John continued, his voice unwavering. "We cannot change the past. But we can decide the future. And the future of this town, of young people like my son, will no longer be ruled by fear or crime. It will be built on courage, unity, and hope." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, filled with a renewed spirit. Above them, the American flag rippled in the wind. A new chapter had begun. A town once lost to darkness had found its light again. And it had all started with a single letter. A lesson for today's world. The story of John Carter and his town's battle against corruption is more than just a tale of heroism. It's a reminder of the power of individual action. Too often, we believe that one person can't make a difference, that the problems around us are too big to solve. But John's story proves otherwise. Change begins when we refuse to stay silent. When we stand up against injustice. When we fight for our families and communities. And when we demand accountability from those in power, we become the force that restores hope. No matter how broken the system may seem, courage, unity, and persistence can always rebuild it. So ask yourself, what can you do today to make a difference?